A girl stayed home alone for a short period of time and disappeared without a trace. What happened next felt more like a detective thriller than a real case, because it was impossible to believe that something like that could have happened in real life. It took 15 years to finally learn the truth, and when it happened, everyone was enraged and shocked. Jessica Dishon was born on May 2nd, 1982, in the small American town of Shepherdsville, Kentucky. It was a quiet place where a lot of residents were involved in farming and knew each other well. Jessica had 2 younger brothers, and from an early age, she helped her parents to take care of the kids while they were working. This made Jessica more independent, and her parents could always rely on her. When she was 15, she took a part-time job at a local restaurant to save up for her first car she dreamed of, a red Pontiac. And a few years later, she had saved enough money to make that dream a reality. Despite her part-time job, Jessica had excellent grades and started to make plans to attend college to become an accountant after school. In the fall of 1999, when she was 17, Jessica entered her senior year. She also started dating a boy and was thrilled about it. On the morning of Friday, September 10th, her day began as usual. Jessica's parents left for work while she was still asleep. Her younger brothers went to the bus stop and left for school. Jessica stayed home and was supposed to drive to school in her car soon after her brothers. Somewhere around noon, her mother returned home and immediately noticed something weird. Jessica's car was parked in front of the house, although she should have been in class at that time. The mother entered the house and went to her daughter's room. Her initial thought was that Jessica might have overslept and missed school, but she wasn't in her bedroom. Next, the mother thought that, for some reason, Jessica might have asked her father for a ride to school. She called him, but he said he had gone to work alone that morning. Thinking there might be something wrong with Jessica's car, the mother took a spare key from the house to try starting it. However, as soon as she approached the car, she saw a disturbing scene. Firstly, the driver's door was slightly open. Secondly, and more alarming, Jessica's cell phone lay on the seat with the numbers 9 and 1 on the screen. Beneath the front seat lay one of Jessica's shoes and her keys, and in the back seat were her textbooks, work clothes, and purse. The mother immediately feared the worst. It was evident that someone had tried to dial 911 on Jessica's phone, but didn't finish it. Moreover, Jessica obviously couldn't have just left all her belongings in the car and walked away. The family lived on the outskirts of town, so she would have had to cover several miles along the road on foot. Jessica's parents called the school, only to hear that their daughter hadn't attended class. Somehow, the school had failed to notify them about this, as it should have done. A few hours later, Jessica's best friend from the restaurant where they both worked called her parents, saying that Jessica hadn't shown up for her shift, increasing their concern. Concerned about Jessica's absence from school and work, and the fact that her belongings, including a phone with 9 and 1 dialed, were left in an unlocked car, her parents decided to call the police. However, the sheriff simply suggested that Jessica likely wandered off and would return home eventually. He didn't even pay any attention to the fact that one of her shoes was left in the car, making it difficult for her to go far without it. Jessica's parents tried to convince the sheriff that their daughter might be in danger, but despite their pleas, he refused to open an investigation, leaving them with no choice but to return home. After that, Jessica's parents decided to take matters into their own hands. They contacted relatives, friends, and acquaintances, but no one had seen her. Together, they started to search for Jessica throughout the town, but she was nowhere to be seen. The next morning, her parents went back to the sheriff and told him that Jessica still didn't make it home. This time, he dispatched 2 officers to inspect her car. But their parents faced yet another problem. The officers examined the vehicle without gloves, touching everything inside with their bare hands. They also didn't check Jessica's room, although it was standard procedure. Once again, let down by law enforcement, Jessica's parents tried to get some help from the local media, drawing their attention to their daughter's disappearance and the police's lack of interest. Alongside relatives and friends, they initiated their own search and also began distributing flyers with information about Jessica. The search was led by Jessica's father and his brother, Stanley, who knew the area well. Fearing the worst, they decided to search the vicinity near a local river. The area had a pretty bad reputation, as it was popular among local drug dealers and other criminals, due to its overgrown and secluded nature. For hours, Jessica's relatives combed through the difficult terrain near the river, but found no trace of her. The next morning, something extremely weird happened. Jessica's parents were at home, and their son was playing in the yard. Suddenly, he rushed inside, claiming he heard a cry for help that sounded like his sister's voice. Jessica's father grabbed his shotgun and rushed outside, trying to locate the source of the cry. At the same time, his brother drove up to their house and quickly joined the search. Soon, they noticed something. There was a smoke rising from their neighbor's property, a 40-year-old man named David Brooks. As they approached, they saw him burning something that resembled clothing on his land. It looked highly suspicious, so Jessica's father asked Brooks for permission to search his farm. Brooks, however, refused and asked them to leave. This wasn't the only weird thing about Brooks. Before Jessica's disappearance, her relatives had maintained a normal relationship with him and his family. However, shortly after that, Brooks began behaving strangely. He started regularly driving slowly past their home, staring at them with an ominous smile. Jessica's parents also received mysterious phone calls where an unknown man remained silent and just breathed heavily. They suspected Brooks was behind it, but couldn't understand the reason for such behavior. After witnessing Brooks burning clothing on his property, Jessica's parents decided to once again speak to the police, who had shown little interest in the case from the beginning. They shared their observations, asking officers to visit Brooks with cadaver dogs, and they agreed. Using Jessica's clothes to track her, the dogs led them to the fire pit on Brooks's property, but no substantial evidence was found. The dogs also discovered black gloves in one of the sheds, signaling the presence of a smell associated with decomposition. Throughout the search, Brooks displayed increasingly suspicious behavior, yet the police failed to connect him to Jessica's disappearance, once again, leaving empty-handed. Disappointed by the police, Jessica's father decided to reach out to the FBI. The Bureau usually refrains from initiating investigations based solely on calls from the relatives of missing persons. But this time, they decided to get involved immediately in light of the disturbing facts presented by Jessica's parents. And after a thorough research, the FBI concluded that something truly horrific might have happened to her. From this point on, a real investigation began, one that local cops had been reluctant to conduct. FBI agents collected fingerprints from Jessica's room and her car. They also seized all potential evidence for analysis and sent it all to the lab. Investigators also organized extensive search on the ground, using helicopters and gathering volunteers. They thoroughly examined the bottom of the pond near Jessica's home, considering the possibility that her body might be there. FBI agents meticulously combed through Brooks's farm, and there they found something very alarming. In one of the sheds, they found a printed photo of Jessica. After this disturbing discovery, detectives were almost certain that Brooks was somehow involved in her disappearance. They also suspected his 35-year-old brother, Joseph, as he behaved strangely while the police were searching his property. However, there was a problem. During the search, investigators found no evidence substantial enough to arrest the brothers, so they focused all their efforts on the search in the area, almost certain that Jessica was no longer alive. On September 27th, 17 days after her disappearance, the police received a call. A woman was driving along the road near the river where Jessica's father had searched for her in the initial days. She saw something strange near a tree just off the road and decided to inspect it. The woman came closer, realized it resembled a human body, and called the police right away. The FBI agents arrived at the scene and indeed found the lifeless body of a young woman, missing some fingers and limbs. She had a rope with tracks of red and silver paint tied around her legs. Parts of her clothing were missing, leading detectives to believe that the perpetrator sexually abused her. Due to the advanced state of decomposition, they couldn't confirm if it was Jessica. The officers went to her house and asked her parents to help identify her. Jessica's father couldn't bring himself to look at his deceased daughter, but her mother agreed. She arrived at the scene and at first couldn't identify her, but soon she noticed a small butterfly tattoo on the body, identical to her daughter's and located on the same spot. Later, medical experts confirmed the identity of the deceased and determined that her cause of death was strangulation. Numerous bruises were also found on her body. Experts revealed that her limbs and fingers were detached post-mortem, meaning she was still alive at the time. But even that wasn't the most devastating fact. It turned out that Jessica had been alive for approximately 3 days after her disappearance. It meant that the police had a chance to save her, yet they took no action whatsoever to do that. After the discovery of the body, the FBI decided to re-interview Brooks, and this time they found out something new. During their initial conversation, he claimed to have seen Jessica near her house on the morning she vanished. However, this time, he changed his story, stating that he hadn't seen her at all that day. Now he claimed he was at home in bed with his wife that morning. And when detectives questioned his wife, she contradicted her husband's testimony. The FBI continued to question Brooks, asking him what he would do if they found his fingerprints on the victim's body. Although there was no such evidence found, Brooks's response was extremely suspicious. He said he would have to confess to everything in that case. Later, he failed a polygraph test, so the FBI decided to arrest him and move forward with the trial. They were aware that the chances of a guilty verdict were relatively low, as they hadn't found any solid evidence linking Brooks to the murder. All they had were disturbing but indirect indications of his involvement. The detectives continued working on the case, searching for any additional evidence as the trial preparations unfolded. Investigators recalled another interesting detail. During the search of Brooks's car, they found a rope similar to the one used to tie the victim's legs. However, no DNA samples were found on it, making it another piece of circumstantial evidence. The trial began in January 2003. Brooks's lawyer insisted on the complete absence of evidence and declared his client's innocence. Something else came to light during the trial, When the body was discovered, investigators also found some missing limbs of the victim nearby. They placed them in special containers and handed them over to the local police. Ignoring labels that said, "store it in the refrigerator," they left the boxes at room temperature, causing extensive decomposition. So even if there was some potential evidence, including possible DNA traces from the killer, it was lost due to this error. All other circumstantial pieces of evidence against Brooks lacked sufficient weight. Ultimately, the jurors couldn't reach a unanimous decision, so the man walked free. According to state laws, he could only be charged again if new evidence was found. For Jessica's parents, this was a devastating blow. They had almost no doubt that Brooks was behind their daughter's murder. Moreover, had the police taken their job more seriously, their daughter might have been saved. So, in the end, they lost all hope of achieving justice. In the following years, this case remained unsolved, and eventually, it was almost entirely abandoned. In 2012, a new detective, Lynn Hunt, joined the local police department. She was assigned to investigate unsolved cases, and her initial focus fell on the murder of Jessica Dishon. Upon reviewing the case files, she was shocked by the negligence of her predecessors. Most of the documents were filled with errors, missing any reference to conversations with the involved parties, and the evidence wasn't properly documented. In other words, it was so ineffectively handled that she had to essentially start the investigation from scratch 13 years after the murder. Her first step was to speak with Jessica's family. One of her brothers, now an adult living separately from his parents, handed her a box of Jessica's belongings from her car. He had kept it since the police returned these items to the family. Once again, Hunt was astonished at how carelessly her colleagues had handled the evidence, failing to store it properly according to protocol. Now, after so many years, these items were unlikely to help her. Yet, she diligently continued to examine everything she could find. Soon, she discovered an interesting detail among the documents. It was Brooks's medical examination report. It stated that his IQ was only 61, which is quite low. This raised concerns about all police actions, including Brooks's interrogations. Given his significantly low IQ, he might have not fully understood most of the questions and could have given less than adequate answers. All of this led Hunt to consider that the man might have no connection to the case at all, as his weird behavior could easily be explained by his extremely low IQ. Then, Hunt began to think, who else could have committed this murder? She extensively researched everyone involved in the case or living nearby. This went on until September 2014, nearly 15 years after Jessica's death. A colleague from another department called Hunt to share intriguing information. An inmate from a Kentucky state prison claimed to know the real identity of Jessica Dishon's murderer. Hunt approached this lead with slight skepticism. Usually, when inmates wanted to share some information with the police, it ended in disappointment and wasted time. Many of them just imagined some stories to secure early release or improve their conditions in prison. Still, she understood that she couldn't ignore this lead without verification. She went to the prison and met with the man who supposedly had the information. According to him, he shared a cell for some time with an individual convicted of child abuse, the same charge as his. On this common ground, the two became friends and exchanged details about their crimes occasionally. One day, the cellmate told him that, among other things, he had murdered Jessica Dishon. After that, the informant dropped a bombshell, giving the detective the name of this man, leaving her in shock. It was Stanley Dishon, Jessica's uncle, her father's brother. According to the informant, Stanley told him that he had sexually abused Jessica for several years while living in their home. He threatened to kill her or someone close to her if she ever talked about it. In the spring of '99, when Jessica got a boyfriend, Stanley began to fear that, sooner or later, she might confess to him about the abuse by her own uncle. On the morning of September 10, Stanley arrived at her home when Jessica was alone. She was outside, getting into her car, having already loaded all her belongings. Stanley approached her and demanded that she break up with her boyfriend. But Jessica refused and threatened to expose him if he didn't leave her alone. He started threatening her, and she reached for the phone, attempting to dial 911. Stanley tried to grab her, but Jessica broke free and ran into the house. The man followed her to her room, struck her, and bound her in her sheets before taking her to an abandoned shed not far from where her body would later be found. Stanley kept her alive there for several days, subjecting her to abuse and torture. Then, he killed her, moved the body to a visible location near the road, and buried the sheets in the ground beneath the shed. He also mentioned that after the murder, he removed some of the victim's limbs, hoping to mislead the police into thinking drug traffickers were involved. Detective Hunt realized that this information was never disclosed. Only Jessica's closest relatives knew about the missing limbs, so the informant couldn't have fabricated this detail. At last, he also added that Stanley buried Jessica's shoe beneath a broken tree near the shed. Hunt decided to verify all this information about the buried evidence. Given the shortage of stuff in the local police department, no one from there could help her, so she reached out to Jessica's brother and a few other relatives who agreed to participate in the search. She didn't tell them that Stanley might be the murderer, as she decided to find some evidence to support these shocking accusations first. On the first day of the search, they failed to uncover any clues. Under the pouring rain, they dug in the areas matching the informant's description, but it yielded no results. The next day, Jessica's brother and Hunt returned to the site. On the way, he pointed out an abandoned barn alongside the road. They headed there and started digging the soil inside, and almost immediately, there was a long-awaited breakthrough. They discovered a buried bedsheet. Hunt collected the evidence and hurried to Jessica's home. Throughout these years, her parent hadn't made any changes to her room. It remained exactly as it was on the day their daughter vanished. Thanks to this, Hunt was able to confirm that the found bedsheet was part of Jessica's bedding. It was absent from the bed, and the other linen shared the same pattern. Immediately after this discovery, Stanley was arrested and brought in for questioning. He refused to confess to the crime, although he appeared visibly shaken during the conversation with the detectives. Eventually, he was charged with murder, and the case proceeded to court. Jessica's father couldn't believe that his own brother had committed such a heinous act against his daughter. He went through a phase of complete denial, but eventually came to terms with this unbearable reality. Later, he recalled that in the early days of Jessica's disappearance, it was Stanley who suggested searching for the body near the river. However, during the search, he suddenly felt sick and his brother drove him home. It turned out this happened just a few hundred yards from the barn where Jessica was located, suggesting that Stanley deliberately diverted them from finding her while she was still alive. During the preparation for the trial, Detective Hunt researched the suspect's past, trying to find some additional evidence. She already knew he had served time for assaulting another girl in their family, but Hunt soon discovered an even more disturbing fact. Several other women closely related to Stanley told the police that he had sexually abused them at a young age. The pattern was consistent. He would tell his relatives that he temporarily had nowhere to live and asked them to let him stay in their home for a while. When left alone with the girls, Stanley committed his vile deeds, using threats to silence them. Hearing all of these stories, the police concluded that Stanley had been doing this for 3 decades. Despite all of this, Detective Hunt realized that securing a conviction for the murder would be challenging, since there were almost no straight pieces of evidence against Stanley, such as fingerprints or DNA. She continued to dig into the case until she stumbled upon a box of old files she hadn't examined yet. Looking through its contents, Hunt was once again shocked by the incompetence of her predecessors who initially handled the case. In the box, there was a letter dated June 26, 2002. Another informant wrote to the police the same story that Hunt heard only 12 years later from the Kentucky prison inmate. By the summer of 2002, Stanley was already serving time for assaulting an underage relative. During that time, he told his cellmate about murdering Jessica. The cellmate, who happened to be a police informant, wrote a letter to the department handling the case, disclosing all the gruesome details of what Stanley had done to his niece. And what do you think the police did? They simply ignored the letter, likely convinced of Brooks's involvement in those years, so they didn't bother considering other suspects. Once again, Hunt was disappointed by her colleagues' lack of professionalism. If only they had paid more attention to their job, this case could have been solved back in 2002. By now, after all these years, she could only await the trial, hoping that Stanley would finally face delayed justice for his actions. The process began in 2015, and Stanley declared his innocence. Present in the courtroom, Jessica's parents could hardly look at their relative who had destroyed their lives. They were also furious that he couldn't just confess to give them some sort of closure. The prosecution believed that the chances of obtaining a guilty verdict on murder charges were relatively low, mainly because there was almost no substantial evidence against him. There was also a problem with the assault charges involving other girls in the family. All of them would have to testify in court, describing Stanley's actions against them in great detail. So, the prosecution decided to offer Stanley a plea deal. They agreed to drop the death penalty in exchange for Stanley's confession, both in assaults on relatives and Jessica's murder. In the end, he agreed and pleaded guilty. As part of the deal, he wasn't required to disclose any specific details of the crimes. Jessica's parents, who desired to know the whole truth, weren't happy about it, but Stanley remained silent. Under the plea deal terms, the murderer received a 20-year prison sentence with the possibility of parole after 15 years. Given that he was 56 at the time of sentencing, Stanley might be released at 71. After the trial, Jessica's father promised that if his brother doesn't die in prison, he'll be waiting for him to take matters into his own hands. In 2019, Stanley gave his first interview, claiming he didn't kill Jessica. According to him, he was at work that morning, but it was impossible to verify after 2 decades. He also couldn't explain how 2 unrelated informants came up with identical stories, including details only known to the murderer, such as a bedsheet's burial site. As for David Brooks, detectives still don't rule out his potential minor involvement in the case. Stanley knew him and could have asked for help in disposing of the victim's belongings. Given Brooks's low IQ, he might have not fully understood the whole situation. It's possible that he burned the girl's clothes in the fire, and Stanley might have handed him the gloves with the scent of the body that the dogs detected. It's also possible that he left Jessica's photo in Stanley's shed to frame him. However, the truth may never be revealed, as Brooks passed away in 2021 due to heart problems. It's worth mentioning the moment when, on the 3rd day of Jessica's disappearance, her younger brother heard a cry for help outside, thinking it was his sister. It's still impossible to say with certainty what happened. At that time, the girl could have still been alive, but Stanley was holding her in the barn a few miles away from her home. Most likely, the child either imagined it due to stress or someone else was screaming, but there's a somewhat unlikely version. As we recall, right after Jessica's father rushed outside, Stanley drove up to the house, which means he was nearby. It could be that the girl was in his car with her mouth taped shut or unconscious. However, this theory seems highly improbable. Jessica Knott was born on June 22, 1986, in the city of Allamont Springs, Florida. She had an older brother, a younger sister, and loving parents. Her father worked as a construction worker, often traveling to other states for several days, leaving the kids alone with their mother. Jessica was a cheerful and lovely child. She liked to spend a lot of time outdoors with friends, play with her siblings, and she also had a deep love for animals. On April 5, 1996, when she was 9, Jessica's family decided to visit her grandparents for Easter. On that day, her dad went to the store to buy some stuff for the holiday, while her mom stayed in their apartment, packing for the upcoming trip. Jessica returned from school with other kids and asked her mom if she could go to the yard. She wanted to wait for her dad, who was supposed to be back from the store soon. Her mom agreed and told her daughter not to go anywhere else. Their apartment complex was situated away from the main road, surrounded by trees. The mother felt relatively secure about Jessica's safety. All the neighborhood kids, including Jessica, always played there without constant adult supervision, and everything was fine. A few hours later, around 6 p.m., her father returned home and asked his wife where Jessica is. She was surprised, as her daughter was supposed to be in the yard, waiting for her father, but he claimed she wasn't there. The parents went outside and searched the entire yard, but they couldn't find Jessica. Frustrated, they decided to check with neighbors, hoping someone had seen their daughter. One neighbor mentioned seeing Jessica in the yard earlier. She was sitting on a bench and reading a book, but that didn't help the worried parents find her. As darkness fell and their daughter remained missing, they decided to call the police. Officers arrived in a few minutes, initiated a search, and started interviewing neighbors. Despite their efforts, they couldn't find Jessica, so the police expanded the search area to nearby streets. A few hours later, an unexpected call came into the police station. The caller's voice was muffled by strong background noise, but the operator heard that they would find the missing girl near a water pumping station a few miles from her home. Police rushed to the location, where they were faced with a heartbreaking scene. Jessica's lifeless body was lying near the station, concealed in a black trash bag. It was only a few yards from the road, but the pumping station was situated beneath a bridge, so it was impossible to notice Jessica from the road. Beside the body were some magazines and a child's mirror. Police quickly identified the victim as Jessica Knott and handed her body over to medical examiners. Meanwhile, the investigators focused on tracing the 911 call. It was pretty evident the call came from the murderer, and police hoped it could help to identify them. But there was a challenge. The call was made from a payphone at a gas station less than a mile from the crime scene. And of course, by the time the officers arrived, the perpetrator had already vanished. Detectives tried to find fingerprints on the phone, but it was quite a challenge. It was a public payphone, so there might be multiple prints. Moreover, investigators realized that the criminal had likely wiped the phone after the call, or used gloves. Experts concluded that the girl was killed elsewhere and her body was transported to the water pumping station. Traces on the ground in front of the facility indicated that the killer likely pulled the body from a vehicle in a trash bag and dragged it across the ground. Jessica's clothing was intact except for one shoe. Police couldn't find it in the bag or in the surrounding area. The only lead found at the crime scene was the tire track on the ground. Police couldn't be certain it belonged to the killer's vehicle, but they photographed it and made a cast. Medical experts examined the body and determined that the victim died from strangulation. Based on marks on her face and neck, it seemed the killer did it with their bare hands. There was also a hamburger found in her stomach, consumed less than an hour before her death. Her mother stated she hadn't given Jessica anything like that on that day, leading police to believe that the food was provided by the killer. Experts also found no signs of sexual assault, leaving the motive of the perpetrator entirely unclear. At first, the police started to consider Jessica's parents as suspects. Neither of them had a solid alibi at the time of her disappearance. The mother claimed she was in the apartment packing, and the father was shopping. But in theory, they both had the opportunity to commit the crime. Police tried to understand how the killer managed to take Jessica from her complex's yard without anyone noticing or the girl screaming. It led them to believe that the perpetrator likely knew the victim well, and she left with him willingly. Another supporting factor was the tone of the killer's voice during the 911 call. Despite the experts' efforts to clean up the recording, they noticed sorrow and regret in the killer's voice, as if they genuinely regretted committing the murder. The fact that the killer took the risk of calling 911 spoke volumes. The perpetrator could have done it either for the thrill of playing with the police and manipulating the investigation, or they genuinely regretted their actions and wanted to somehow alleviate that feeling. Considering the caller's evident sadness, investigators leaned towards the second option. Police inspected Jessica's father's car, finding something intriguing in the trunk. There was a roll of black trash bags similar to the one containing the victim's body. However, an expert examining the bag from the crime scene quickly determined it differed from those found in the father's car, clearly belonging to a different roll. So the man was temporarily ruled out as a suspect, and investigators shifted their focus to others. Forensic experts examined the victim's clothing and body for possible clues, and they uncovered a few leads. There was a substantial amount of dog hair. Considering Jessica's family didn't own a dog, the animal most likely belonged to the killer. They also found human hair on her body, belonging to an unknown white male. However, experts needed a few days to extract the DNA profile. 2 types of foreign fibers were also discovered on the girl's clothes. Analyzing their structure, experts concluded that one likely came from a car seat cover and the other from a carpet. This further supported the theory that the victim was killed elsewhere and transported to the water pumping station by car. Regarding the dog hair from Jessica's clothing, experts attempted to determine the breed using the FBI's database, which contained microscopic photos of hair from various dog breeds. This database has proven helpful in criminal cases where dog hair could be a key piece of evidence. Experts compared the hair with samples from the database, eliminating one breed after another. In the end, they concluded that the hair on the victim's clothes belonged to a Shar-Pei. Apparently, the killer owned such a dog, and the hair ended up on Jessica's clothes, either in the perpetrator's car or at their house. According to the preliminary theory of investigators, the killer somehow might have lured Jessica into his car, taken her to McDonald's for a hamburger, and then brought her to his home and murdered her. Meanwhile, the experts attempted to enhance the phone call recording, but it proved to be a challenging task. They decided to try a different approach. Detectives sought assistance from NASA and sent them the audio file. NASA had advanced tools for clearing audio recordings, originally designed to enhance recordings from space. They agreed to help and provided the police with a higher quality audio track. However, the experts still needed a voice sample from the suspect to compare it with the call recording and establish a match. Based on the detectives' assumption that the killer might have known Jessica, they decided to play the call recording for her mother, hoping she could recognize it. She listened to it for the first time and said that the voice sounded familiar, but the mother couldn't remember whose voice it is. However, during a second attempt, it clicked. She recognized the voice as their neighbor who lived in the same complex. Although she couldn't remember his name, she told their detectives that the man often walked his Shar-Pei in the yard. Police swiftly identified the man as 35-year-old James Crow, During the initial hours of Jessica's disappearance, investigators already questioned him, along with other neighbors. He mentioned that he saw her in the yard while walking his dog. They spoke briefly, and he left. Detectives dug into his background and found that Crow had no criminal history. He lived with his wife, who was a nurse. The man was a former truck driver, currently unemployed. He spent most of his time strolling the streets with his Shar-Pei, named Pumpkin. The detectives realized that merely the similarity in voice and owning a dog of a specific breed wasn't enough for an arrest, so they obtained a search warrant for his car. There, they discovered two disturbing clues. Under the front passenger seat, there was an empty Happy Meal bag. Considering Jessica had a McDonald's hamburger in her stomach and James didn't have children, this seemed highly suspicious. Experts also noticed that the car had brand new tires, as if they had barely been used. Police found out that Crow replaced them on the day of Jessica's murder, even though his previous tires were not particularly old and could have lasted for several more years. Crow claimed to have left the old tires at a car service, which was quite unusual considering they were not old at all, so the police headed to this service building. By the time they arrived, there was only one tire from James's car left. They compared its tread pattern from what was found near the body, but detectives faced an unexpected twist. They didn't match. However, they initially weren't 100% sure that the tire mark on the ground was left by the killer's car and not some other vehicle. For example, maintenance staff regularly visited the building, and this tire mark could have belonged to their vehicle. The police also searched James's apartment, where they found a new lead. There was a box containing several rolls of trash bags matching the size and color of the one found on the victim's body. Obviously, this couldn't be considered strong evidence, so detectives had to figure out if there was a way to establish that the bags had come from the same roll. At first glance, this task seemed impossible. The bags themselves had no markings or distinctive features, and there were hundreds of manufacturers of such products. But even the detectives were soon surprised by the creativity they could display in such a complex challenge. They contacted Noel Roberts, the man responsible for quality control at the company that produced the bags found in the suspect's apartment. At first, he identified the specific factory where the bags were produced. There was a special code on the cardboard box containing the rolls, indicating that the product was made at a facility in Virginia. The expert then explained that a tiny amount of iron or titanium is included in the composition of the bags, depending on their color. Considering that the factory produces bags of various colors, the materials in the production are constantly changing. The ratio of plastic to iron or titanium literally changes daily, since such tiny amounts cannot be measured with 100% accuracy, and there's no need to do that. In other words, experts could take bags from the suspect's apartment and the crime scene, measure the presence of the elements in the plastic using high-intensity X-rays, and get a very precise ratio. Through this analysis, they found that the ratio of iron and titanium to plastic in both bags was absolutely identical, indicating that they were manufactured on the same day and should belong to the same batch. But that's not all. During the production of trash bags, a small amount of microscopic debris ends up on the machines, which is acceptable within production standards. However, this results in small streaks visible to the naked eye when the plastic sheets, later cut into bags, are rolled out. These streaks are present on every bag in large amounts, forming a unique pattern for each roll of fabric. The debris particles on the conveyor belt are constantly moving, falling off, and being replaced by new ones, so the pattern of similar streaks is preserved for a maximum of a few hundred feet of fabric. This means that it can be understood from this pattern that two different bags were not just made within the same batch, but within a few hours of each other. Experts compared the bags from the suspect's apartment and the crime scene, and the lines on them matched with astonishing precision. But that's not all. The experts also explained that after the bags are manufactured, they are rolled into a bundle using a machine, which often does this somewhat unevenly. But if you don't look closely, these deviations are almost imperceivable, and the rolls appear smooth. However, examining the edges of the bags reveals tiny folds and creases, forming a similarly unique pattern as with the streaks. In the end, the experts compared the bags again and found that the pattern on the bags from James's apartment matched the one from the crime scene. Considering all of this, they concluded that the bag used by the killer was not just produced by the same company, but was manufactured within a range of almost 17 boxes apart. This meant that with a high degree of probability, the perpetrator took the bag from one of the rolls in James's apartment. Forensic analysts also compared the two types of fibers found on Jessica's clothing with the carpet in the suspect's apartment and the covers of his car seats. Both samples matched. Finally, a sound expert compared the 911 call recording with a voice sample from James and concluded that the voice belonged to the same person. Despite the incredible work done by the experts, detectives faced one major problem. All this fell into the realm of circumstantial evidence, but they were confident in James's involvement and decided to arrest him. The man was taken into custody, and the prosecution announced its intent to seek the death penalty. Considering that Crowe continued to deny his guilt, the case proceeded to trial. The prosecution presented their version of how this crime happened. James spent a lot of time outside with his dog, and all the local kids knew him well, since they never missed a chance to play with Pumpkin. As a result, they trusted him, and Jessica was no exception. According to the police version, on that day, James noticed her alone on a bench while walking his dog and started a conversation. He offered to take her to McDonald's, promising to buy her a hamburger, and Jessica agreed because she knew him well. After the restaurant, he presumably took her back to the apartment complex and invited her to his place. Perhaps he offered her to play with Pumpkin. His wife was at work, and the presence of carpet fibers from his living room on Jessica's clothes indicated that she was there on the day of her death. According to investigators, James might have attempted to assault the girl, but something went wrong. Based on the forensic report, the perpetrator not only strangled the victim with his bare hands, but also pressed his palm against her face. Perhaps Jessica tried to scream, so he panicked and attacked her. After the girl passed away, he placed her in a garbage bag to transport the body to his car without arousing suspicion from the neighbors. He drove a few miles and left the body near a water station, made the 911 call from a nearby gas station, and returned home. During preliminary hearings, James's lawyers attempted to challenge all available evidence, arguing that there were no solid proof of their client's guilt. Despite the fact that the judge accepted it, the defense was right. In cases involving the death penalty, the standards for evidence are much higher, and in James's case, there was a significant chance of avoiding this sentence. In light of these circumstances, a plea deal was proposed to the suspect. Under the terms of the deal, he would admit guilt to second-degree murder and receive a 40 prison-year sentence without parole, thus avoiding the death penalty. In the summer of '98, 2 years after the murder, James agreed to the deal. He wasn't required to disclose any details of the crime by its terms. However, he mentioned that part of his decision was to spare Jessica's family and save them from going through the trial. The prosecution believed the perpetrator genuinely showed remorse, citing his 911 call, the purpose of which remained unclear. The only logical explanation in this context was that James sincerely wanted to alleviate his guilt for such a heinous crime. Jessica's parents were not pleased with the deal, as they had hoped for the death penalty. They also wanted the killer to confess, but James remained silent. Nevertheless, he didn't live to see the end of his term. James passed away in November 2011 at the age of 49 due to health problems, taking the details of his actions and motives with him to the grave. Jessica's case involved truly unique work by experts and detectives. The amount of information they gathered by examining ordinary garbage bags astonished even the judge, who had never encountered such evidence throughout his career. Rowan Ford was born on April 11, 1998, in San Diego, California. Her parents divorced when she was young, and her mother, Colleen, moved with her to a small town called Stella in Missouri. Later, her mom met a man named David and they got married. Colleen had several children from a previous marriage, and soon after their wedding, she and David had a daughter together. Altogether, Rowan had 2 sisters and 2 brothers, and they shared a very close bond. She spent a lot of time outdoors, riding her bike around town, enjoying swimming, and indulging in her passion for drawing. She also liked going to Sunday school at the local church, where she always volunteered to help other kids who had some issues with their tasks. In November 2007, when Rowan was 9 years old, she was in the 4th grade at the local elementary school. Her mom worked the night shift at a store, while her stepdad spent most of the day on the farm. This left Rowan often fending for herself, which made her very independent. On November 2nd, she stayed home alone as usual. Her mom went to work, and her stepdad hadn't returned from the farm yet. The next morning, around 9 a.m., Colleen came home from her night shift and checked Rowan's room, but her daughter wasn't there. She asked her husband where her daughter was. He said she had asked him if she could have a sleepover at a friend's house, and he had let her go. He didn't even ask the friend's name because their town was very small, and he wasn't worried about anything happening to her. But Colleen started to worry and decided to check with all of Rowan's friends. Since there were only a few streets in their town, it didn't take long. But none of them had seen her, and she hadn't stayed over at any of their houses, which made her mother even more concerned. Colleen searched the whole town, but couldn't find her daughter. She went back home and told her husband that Rowan was nowhere to be found. She asked him to call the police and report her missing, but he reassured her that everything was fine and that she would come home soon. After waiting for several more hours with no sign of Rowan, Colleen took matters into her own hands and dialed 911 herself. The local sheriff immediately organized a search operation. He went to their house to speak with David, as he was the last person to see Rowan before she disappeared. David said that on that evening, while he was working on the farm with his colleague, Christopher, their mutual friend, Nathan, came by. They all decided to go to David's place to have some drinks and play pool. They stopped by the store, bought some alcohol, and went to David's house, where they spent several hours. Later in the night, Christopher asked Nathan to drive him home to the neighboring town where his trailer was, and they persuaded David to join them to continue the fun. Before leaving the house, he checked on Rowan in her room. Seeing that she was asleep, David left with his friends. They stopped by the store again, grabbed more alcohol, and headed to Christopher's trailer, where they continued drinking for about an hour. After that, David decided to head home and asked Nathan to give him a ride. Nathan agreed, but chose to take back roads instead of the main highway. By that time, he was quite drunk and didn't want to risk encountering the police. Nathan dropped him off and drove home, while David went straight to bed. Soon after, he was awakened by Rowan, who asked if she could sleep over at a friend's house. Without much thought, he agreed and fell back asleep. Police approached this story with some skepticism. What puzzled them most was the fact that a 9-year-old girl decided to go to her friend's house in the middle of the night, and her stepfather let her go without even asking which friend she was talking about. The sheriff considered that David might be hiding something or directly involved in Rowan's disappearance, but he had no evidence to support this theory. Police searched the town and its surroundings until late at night. Local residents immediately joined the search, as they all knew Rowan's family and wanted to help. The population of Stella was only about 150 people, so news of her disappearance spread throughout the county almost instantly. People were used to being able to let their children play outside without a worry, as nothing ever happened in such a quiet place. But now, when Rowan vanished without a trace and the police were unable to find her for a whole day, the residents of Stella were in a state of panic. The first day of the search yielded no results. On November 4th, the police went to the neighboring town to speak with Christopher, who fully corroborated David's story. However, Christopher added that his friend hadn't even contacted him since that evening, and he had only just found out about Rowan's disappearance. On the same day, the police expanded the search and involved even more volunteers, but they still couldn't find Rowan or any clues to her whereabouts. The next morning, the FBI joined the investigation. While the local police continued to search for Rowan throughout the town and its surroundings, detectives focused on exploring the possibility of abduction. They strongly doubted the stepfather's story, as it seemed highly questionable. Police also checked with all of Rowan's friends and confirmed that she hadn't visited any of them that night. Investigators continued to speak with David, and he changed certain details in his story several times, further raising suspicions against him. For instance, he gave conflicting timelines for his absence from home that night and even said that perhaps Rowan hadn't asked him for permission to go to her friend's house and just left without his knowledge. FBI agents also discovered that on the night of her disappearance, David had asked his mother to borrow her car, a fact he had initially not disclosed to the police. As a result, they decided to seize both this car and his own pickup truck for examination, but experts were unable to uncover any evidence. Meanwhile, detectives decided to speak with Christopher and Nathan again, as they were both with David that evening. Police invited Christopher to the station. He repeated the same story as the day before. He also agreed to a polygraph test, which showed no signs of deception. Several hours after Christopher left the station and returned to work, he noticed Sheriff Clark's car and waved for him to stop. Sheriff Clark led the police department in their town, called Witten, and had known Christopher for 17 years, since his childhood. The sheriff was friends with his foster parents, and Christopher always respected him. He often sought his advice or help in difficult times, such as when his mother passed away. Sheriff Clark approached Christopher, and they discussed Rowan's disappearance. The sheriff was aware of the case, but had not been involved in it, as the search was being handled by the Stella department. During their conversation, the sheriff felt that Christopher's behavior was quite weird, and he suspected that Christopher might be withholding some information from him. Considering that Rowan's life was at stake and her fate remained unknown, Clark decided to share his suspicions with the FBI. He contacted the agents and told them about his concerns. Investigators assumed that Christopher might be withholding some significant information that could implicate Rowan's stepfather in her disappearance. Perhaps he had asked Christopher to lie and change certain details in the story of that evening. And now, Christopher feared being implicated as an accomplice if he told the truth. Sheriff Clark informed the FBI agents that he had a close and trusting relationship with Christopher, so he offered to help persuade him to talk. That same evening, Christopher went to Colleen's house to ask her if there was any progress in the search. About the same time, FBI agents also arrived to speak with Rowan's mother again. When they saw Christopher there, they also asked him some questions, and he once again repeated that the events of that evening unfolded exactly as he had previously said. But then, he mentioned for the first time that he did not rule out the possibility of David's involvement in her disappearance, and said that he wanted to help them uncover the truth, no matter how terrible it might be. He even suggested wearing a wire and going to talk to David to try to coax him into confessing, but at that point, the detectives decided not to resort to such tactics. Instead, they asked Christopher if he had any locations in mind where his friend could have hidden Rowan's body, and he named several places. The next morning, police set out to search these locations, as well as continuing their search in the surrounding areas of Stella. FBI agents once again brought David for questioning, but he repeatedly denied any involvement. Detectives searched his home in an attempt to find any leads, but it turned up nothing. Meanwhile, Christopher went to the sheriff's office to speak with Clark and told him about his encounter with the FBI. During their conversation, the sheriff had a strong feeling that Christopher was still withholding something. After their meeting, he contacted the detectives again and told them that Christopher might be keeping some information that could likely help them prove David's involvement. FBI agents asked the sheriff to continue trying to persuade him to talk. Based on the fact that Christopher had repeatedly contacted Clark to discuss the case with him, they believed he wanted to share important information, but for some reason, he was afraid to do so. The next day, on November 7th, the police called Christopher back to the station. They needed his consent to search his safe, located in David's house. Christopher had been living with him for several months when he temporarily didn't have a place of his own, and some of his belongings were still there. Christopher gave them his permission and also agreed to allow the police to search his trailer and his car. He also voluntarily provided them with a DNA sample, and he agreed to answer the detectives' questions again. They began questioning him about that evening and once again asked him to confirm David's story. But this time, Christopher suddenly admitted that his friend's story wasn't entirely true, and the investigators began pressing him to tell them what really happened. But this pressure only caused Christopher to become agitated. He said that if the police were going to treat him like a criminal and attempt to accuse him of involvement in Rowan's disappearance, he would not continue this conversation. After that, detectives had to end the interrogation, and Christopher left the station. That same evening, he went to Sheriff Clark and told him about it. He complained that the detectives were treating him like a suspect and said that he might need to hire a lawyer. The sheriff replied that it was his right, but asked him to understand that the police were just doing everything possible to find Rowan. In response, Christopher stated that he would no longer speak with them and that if he wanted to share anything else, he would only speak with Clark. The sheriff continued to persuade Christopher to tell him everything he knew, and at some point, Christopher began to cry. He said that he always loved Rowan and would never harm her. During the time when he lived in David's house, he developed a close bond with Rowan and the other children. They began to treat him like a family member and even called him Uncle Christopher. The sheriff understood that Christopher was on the brink of revealing everything he knew. However, just as Christopher was about to speak, someone arrived at the police station, distracting Sheriff Clark for some time. Christopher left the office without sharing what he had intended to. Sheriff Clark reached out to the FBI again and told them about this conversation. He explained that Christopher was almost ready to disclose everything he knew, but cautioned that pushing him too hard might cause him to stop talking and get an attorney. Clark suggested to give Christopher some time to think it over, and the detectives agreed. The search for Rowan continued the next day, again with no luck. But everything changed on November 9th, a week after her disappearance. Search groups reached a remote area near a town called Powell, 10 miles from Stella. There, amidst fields and trees, they discovered a large pit in the ground. When they looked there, they found Rowan's body, concealed under leaves and debris. She was missing all clothing below the waist, except for one sock. Medical experts found signs of strangulation and also determined that she had been sexually assaulted. Shortly after the body's discovery, FBI agents contacted Sheriff Clark and asked him to speak with Christopher again, hoping he would now reveal everything. Sheriff learned that earlier that morning, Christopher had visited the station when he wasn't there and informed other officers that he needed to speak urgently with Clark. The sheriff set out to search for Christopher, checking all the places where he might be, but the man was nowhere to be found. It continued until Christopher called Clark himself. He was clearly distressed and asked if he was being followed. He explained that after hearing the news about Rowan's body being found, he drove around town to clear his head and noticed a gray car tailing him. Sheriff Clark replied that he knew nothing about any surveillance and suggested meeting Christopher in person. When they met, Christopher was visibly nervous and expressed concern for his safety. He feared that after Rowan's body was discovered, he might be accused of murder, and someone might seek revenge against him. Clark took him to the station and said that now, when the case had been classified as a homicide, it was time to reveal everything he knew. Christopher began crying again, and the sheriff asked him to tell what David had done to Rowan. In response, Christopher stated that there were too many people at the police station, and he didn't want to discuss it here. He suggested going to a quieter place and mentioned a small bridge located a few miles from their town. Clark agreed, and they drove there together. As they got out of the car, Christopher unexpectedly raised his hands and said that he should handcuff him. The sheriff was surprised and replied that it wasn't necessary, but Christopher said, "After what I tell you, you'll have to do it." After this, he began talking. Christopher repeated the first part of the story he had told the police many times. He, along with Nathan and David, went to his trailer where they continued drinking. Sometime later, his friends decided to head home, and David asked Nathan for a ride. They said they would take back roads to avoid the police and left. But then Christopher started telling something that shocked the sheriff to the core. He claimed that he wanted to sexually assault Rowan and quickly came up with a plan. Knowing his friends would take quite some time on the road through the fields, he got into his car and drove straight to David's house, taking the main highway. He entered Rowan's room, picked her up, and carried her to his car, doing it all so that she wouldn't wake up. After that, he took her to his trailer, where he assaulted her. According to him, she only woke up at that moment and tried to resist, but she couldn't break free. Christopher didn't turn on the lights or speak to her because he didn't want Rowan to recognize him. After the crime, he planned to take her back home and leave, but things didn't go as planned. When he carried Rowan out of the trailer, the moon was shining brightly and she saw his face. Christopher panicked, grabbed a rope, and strangled her. When she passed away, he loaded her body into the car and started thinking about what to do next. At first, he wanted to dump her from the bridge, the same one where he stood with Sheriff Clark. But Christopher realized that her body would be found too quickly, so he got behind the wheel and began driving around the county, considering other options. Soon, he remembered the large pit near the neighboring town and headed there. He dumped the body into the pit and tried to cover it with branches, but the pit was too large, so everything fell down. When he returned to the trailer, he found traces of Rowan's blood on his clothes and mattress. Christopher also realized he needed to get rid of her pants, underwear, and the rope he used to kill her. He collected all these items and placed them in a large barrel, intending to burn them. However, Christopher quickly realized that such a fire would definitely attract attention, so he dragged the barrel into the shed, closed the door, and started the fire there. Sheriff Clark was completely taken back by this story. All this time, he thought David had committed the crime, and Christopher was just withholding some information. It was hard for him to believe that the man he had known for almost 20 years was capable of such brutality. Christopher himself had 3 young children, although he didn't live with them after divorcing his wife. He always seemed like a decent man to him, but reality turned out to be way more chilling. After Christopher finished his story, he agreed to voluntarily go to the station, and the sheriff didn't handcuff him. Only after they arrived and the man repeated his confession to the FBI agents, he was arrested on charges of murder. Christopher also signed a voluntary consent to search his trailer and car. Ending his confession, he added that he regretted his actions and said that he cried like a baby all the next day. The detectives immediately went to speak with David and informed him that Christopher had confessed to the murder. Considering David's strange behavior and inconsistent statements, they suspected that he might have been covering for his friend. However, they were met with an even more shocking twist. When David was brought in for questioning, he suddenly changed his version of events. According to him, the night he returned home and found Rowan missing from her room, he realized that Christopher might have taken her, so he took his mother's car and drove to his trailer. Upon entering, he saw the girl on the bed with Christopher, leaning over her. Instead of rescuing Rowan, David decided to join in. He also sexually assaulted her. Then, he helped his friend kill her and dispose of the body. David added that during the ordeal, his brain simply shut off and he remembered nothing about the night for several days. The detectives, who were not expecting such a twist, went back to Christopher to confirm David's words. However, Christopher stated that his friend was not involved and that everything happened as he had told them. This further baffled the detectives, but Christopher's story matched the facts. Medical experts confirmed that the victim had been strangled with a thin rope, a detail only the killer would know. During a search of the trailer, the police found a barrel with ashes. In his car, they also discovered hair comparable to Rowan's. Despite investigators still being unable to confidently determine whose version of events was truthful, Both men provided incriminating statements, so David was also arrested, and their cases were sent to court. During the trial, Christopher filed a motion to exclude all his statements from the case materials, claiming he was unaware they could be used against him, and that the police violated his rights. But the judge denied this motion, since all his conversations with investigators were entirely voluntary. Christopher also attempted to plead mitigating circumstances, pointing out his difficult childhood. From an early age, he was constantly shuffled between biological and foster parents, which greatly impacted him. Christopher also invited an expert who claimed he had signs of developmental issues. But none of this helped him avoid punishment. In 2012, 5 years after the murder, he was sentenced to death. He tried to appeal this sentence, but to no avail. As for David, the situation was much more complicated. He admitted to assaulting and killing Rowan, but there was one serious problem. His version contradicted Christopher's statements. If the prosecution decided to charge David with murder, it could potentially lead to Christopher's sentence being overturned, and David might also avoid responsibility. Considering there was no solid evidence against David, such as DNA, the prosecution could not take such a risk. In fact, they still weren't sure if he was involved at all. The prosecution did not rule out the possibility that David might have indeed committed the crime together with Christopher, but there was no evidence to support this theory. In the end, a difficult decision was made. To avoid the risk of Christopher's sentence being overturned, they reduced David's charges to much lighter ones. He pleaded guilty to 2 charges: child endangerment and obstruction of justice. He was sentenced to 11 years in prison, with a minimum of 5 years to be served behind bars. This sentence was met with outrage. If David was indeed involved in the murder, his punishment was deemed incomparable to the severity of the crime. However, there's nothing that can be done about it now, and it's unlikely that he will ever be tried again for this case. As for Christopher, he remains in prison, awaiting execution. Considering that decades often pass between sentencing and execution, there are no guarantees that the death penalty will ever be carried out. It's quite possible that he will simply spend the rest of his life in prison. Kaylee Ann Poulton was born on September 20th, 1989, in Rochester, New York. She was the only child in the family, and her parents gave her all their attention and love. When she turned 3, they decided to get divorced, and Kaylee stayed with her mom. Her father maintained a good relationship with his ex-wife and visited his daughter all the time. Kaylee's mom, Judy, moved to an apartment complex located in a quiet suburban area of Rochester. Despite her ex-husband helping to take care of their daughter, Judy had some financial difficulties. When Kaylee was 4, her mom took on a part-time job to save up enough money for a trip to Disney World with her daughter the following summer. Judy's job was delivering magazines to customers in her neighborhood. On the evening of May 23rd, 94, she was getting ready for her shift. She was sitting at home, placing leaflets into the magazines before heading out to deliver them. Around 6:45 p.m., Kaylee asked to go out for a walk. It was a beautiful, sunny evening outside, and she wanted to ride her tricycle. Judy looked outside and saw that there were plenty of other kids playing in the yard, so she agreed to let her daughter go out for a few minutes. She told her to stay within the yard, and Kaylee ran out onto the street with her tricycle. Judy had only a few minutes left to finish with the leaflets. After that, she planned to deliver the magazines and take Kaylee to McDonald's. Once she was done, she grabbed the magazines and took them to the car, planning to call Kaylee back home. But when Judy stepped outside, her daughter wasn't there. She looked around, called out her name, and there was no response. Judy walked around the yard, then began to roam the complex grounds, but Kaylee was nowhere to be seen. The mother also didn't hear the sounds of her tricycle. When Kaylee rode it on the street, its wheels made quite a noticeable creaking noise, but it was silent outside. With each passing second, Judy's panic grew, and her cries quickly gathered the neighbors' attention. She asked them if anyone had seen her daughter, but only a few people had seen her in the yard with other children and didn't know where she had gone. Upon learning that Kaylee had disappeared, the neighbors joined the search, but they couldn't find her or her bicycle. Most of the complex territory was covered with trees, and around it was a fence separating the houses from the nearby highway. Judy was sure that her daughter couldn't have gone anywhere on her own. Kaylee knew she was only allowed to ride in their yard, and she had never disobeyed her mother before. She also couldn't have gone far on her small bike, and she would have been found right away. Fearing the worst, Judy decided to call the police. Officers arrived on the scene within minutes and immediately began searching. Soon, they were joined by firefighters and canine units. While searching the complex and its surroundings, officers went door to door. The police strongly believed that Kaylee was still somewhere at the complex. If this was a case of abduction, the most logical suspects were its residents. An outsider would hardly have been able to enter the premises, snatch Kaylee from the yard, and drive away without anyone noticing. The complex had 300 units, and the residents willingly let the police in, sincerely wanting to help find the girl. In cases where no one was home, the complex manager used spare keys to let the officers inside. Unfortunately, all of this yielded no results. Kaylee and her bicycle were not found in any apartment. The search continued throughout the night, and around 4 a.m., the case was reclassified as a kidnapping. A special unit took over, and detectives asked Judy if there was anyone in their lives who might wish them harm. They asked about Kaylee's father, but Judy denied his possible involvement because he had absolutely no reason to kidnap his daughter. The detectives asked if there was anyone among the complex residents who behaved strangely or suspiciously, and Judy shared one observation. She mentioned a 22-year-old man named Mark who had recently moved into the complex with his wife and 1.5-year-old son. According to Judy, Mark's behavior seemed very unusual and even alarming. They had met a few times in the yard and engaged in small conversations. Once, he said her daughter was very beautiful. Judy had often heard similar compliments from others, but the tone in which Mark said it seemed weird to her. After that, he added something even more unsettling. He said he had been watching all the little girls in the complex, and Kaylee was the prettiest. Obviously, these words seemed highly suspicious to the mother, and after that, she tried to avoid any contacts with Mark. Although, they continued to occasionally see each other in the yard, and once, he asked Judy a very alarming question. He inquired if Kaylee would tell her if someone tried to touch her. Judy answered yes and immediately left the yard, considering such questions extremely suspicious. Prior to these conversations with Mark, Kaylee liked to play with his son on the playground. But since then, Judy didn't let her daughter near him, even in her presence. During the conversation with detectives, Judy remembered something else. About a few minutes after she went outside to look for her daughter, she saw Mark in the yard, coming out with his son to the playground. She asked him if he had seen Kaylee, and the man said no. Judy also noticed something strange, but at that moment, she didn't pay much attention to it, as her mind was preoccupied with fear for her daughter. She saw that his sneakers were missing shoelaces. The detectives decided to talk to Mark and brought him in for questioning. The man denied any involvement in Kaylee's disappearance and even agreed to take a polygraph test. The operator didn't detect any false answers, so Mark had to be released. Also, Judy herself basically provided him with an alibi, as she saw the man on the playground with his son at the exact time when she was looking for her daughter. The police also searched his apartment in the early hours of the investigation, but they didn't find Kaylee's bicycle or the girl herself. Thus, Mark stopped being considered a suspect, and the detectives continued their investigation. With no leads in hand, they began to check Judy for possible involvement in her daughter's disappearance. Judy understood that this was a standard procedure and repeatedly answered all their questions. However, the fact that the police, lacking other suspects, were spending so much time on her only added to her suffering. Information about Kaylee's disappearance soon appeared in local news, as well as on billboards and flyers throughout the city. The police received numerous calls with tips, the total number of which quickly exceeded 1,000, and investigators quickly checked on each one. Unfortunately, they all led to dead ends, and eventually, the case went cold for months. Despite the lack of progress, Judy never stopped hoping to find her daughter alive. She left her job and dedicated all her time to search. She's been printing and posting flyers, contacting various media outlets, and overall doing everything to keep the case in the public eye. She was also joined by some compassionate people who not only helped distribute flyers, but also managed to raise $100,000, which was offered as a reward for any useful information about Kaylee's disappearance. Judy even mentioned to get this case covered on national television. She was invited to the Oprah Winfrey Show, and information about her daughter's disappearance appeared twice on a popular TV show dedicated to unsolved crimes. Judy also collaborated with local businesses to have flyers with information about Kaylee's disappearance constantly present in their offices, establishments, and on commercial vehicles. She even persuaded 2 airlines to include these flyers in envelopes with tickets. All of this helped to gather new leads, and the police diligently investigated each one, but they never managed to come close to solving the case. This went on for 2 years until something unexpected happened. On August 9th, 1996, a woman called the police and told them about a serious argument she had with her husband. According to her, she was tired of her husband's strange behavior and stated that she wanted to divorce him. In response, the man began to persuade her not to do that and try to evoke her sympathy. While telling her how difficult things were for him, the man suddenly confessed to his wife that he had killed Kaylee Polton, plunging his wife into deep shock. The woman immediately took their child, went to her father's house, and called 911. Finally, she revealed her husband's name to the police. It was Mark Christie, Judy's neighbor. Detectives were surprised by his wife's story, but they immediately encountered a serious problem. Under the state law, any information shared between spouses was protected and could not be used in court. In other words, even if Mark wasn't lying, the police were not allowed to arrest or question him. Also, as we remember, the man's apartment was searched in the early hours of the investigation, and he's been in the yard with his child shortly after Kaylee's disappearance, so the police doubted he had the time to kidnap and kill her. Despite this, Detective Crow, who listened to Mark's wife's story, decided to talk to him. He found out that the man and his family moved out of Kaylee's complex just a few weeks after her disappearance, due to some very serious accusations. It turned out Mark had been reported by the parents of 2 girls for standing naked in his doorway in plain sight. No investigation was conducted on this matter because technically he was in his own home, but the fact itself seemed extremely suspicious to the detective. Mark had moved to another city located 50 miles from Rochester, and Crow headed there. But he was met with an unpleasant surprise. Instead of Mark, his mother opened the door and said that her son wouldn't talk to the police without a lawyer present, whom they had already called. It seemed that Mark had learned about his wife's call to the police, and Detective Crow realized there wasn't much for him to do in this situation. Since a confession made to his spouse couldn't be used in court, Mark's lawyer could easily prohibit the police from speaking to his client, allowing Mark to continue living freely without fear of prosecution. But Crow wasn't ready to give up yet. While he was talking to Mark's mother, the man himself eventually came out, and the detective managed to convince him that he just wanted to ask a few questions about Kaylee's case. Crow suggested they drive to the nearest restaurant and chat over a cup of coffee. To his surprise, Mark agreed, but on the condition that the detective would take him to his lawyer afterward. They stopped at an Italian restaurant nearby, and during the whole time, the detective engaged in casual conversation with Mark, trying not to push things or pressure him. And this tactic paid off. While they were waiting for their order, Mark suddenly started talking. He expressed regret for what he had done to Kaylee, saying that his actions had haunted him for the past 2 years. According to him, he constantly saw Kaylee in the news and on flyers, and her face haunted him everywhere. Crow continued to proceed cautiously, not wanting to spook Mark with excessive pressure. He had known him since the early days of the investigation, but this wasn't their first conversation. Crow believed that Mark was proud of himself because he outsmarted police and avoided punishment. So the detective decided to play on his ego. He told Mark that he had indeed managed to deceive the entire team of investigators working on the case, and this tactic proved effective. Mark replied that he didn't want to sound like he was proud of himself, but the way he got rid of the bicycle was truly ingenious. Mark asked the detective if he wanted to know the details. However, he warned him He would only talk about the bicycle and nothing more. Crow continued to maintain a soft, even friendly tone to avoid scaring Mark and to gather as much information as possible, reassuring him that he didn't have to talk about anything he didn't want to. Then Mark stated that Kaylee's tricycle had been in his apartment for 3 days since her disappearance. He knew that police would search every apartment because when a child is in danger, they don't need a warrant. But there was some sort of loophole in the law. It allowed police to search for a missing child, but not for evidence. It means they could only search places where a child could fit. Mark quickly decided to cut the bike into pieces and hide them in different parts of the apartment that were obviously too small to fit a child. For example, he wrapped some parts in clothes and fit them in closets, while others he placed in small bags and took them out to his car. He then gradually disposed of them, taking the pieces far away from home. Police officers were stationed at the exit of the complex, inspecting each car. But like with the apartment, they were only looking for the missing girl, so the small bags didn't detract their attention. Listening to this, Detective Crow realized he had a strong chance of obtaining a full confession from Mark. He began to tell him that perhaps Kaylee's death wasn't his fault, and it was a tragic accident. In response, Mark asked what prison sentence he could face, and Crow replied that most likely it would be around 25 years. Mark said that it would be unfair to him to make him spend half his life behind bars, away from his wife and son. He also added that for the past 2 years, he had been living in his personal hell, and that should count for something in sentencing. Despite the obvious lack of sense in these words, Crow continued with his tactic and told Mark that perhaps he should ease his suffering and tell what really happened. Mark replied that he is ready to confess everything, but only after talking to a lawyer. Of course, the detective understood that no lawyer would allow his client to confess to a crime, even if he really committed it, if there was no evidence against him. So he decided to be honest with Mark about this and added that in that case, Kaylee's parents would never know what happened to their daughter or if she suffered before her death. And then Mark replied, she didn't suffer. The detective sensed that the man was ready to confess everything, so he said it was time to do the right thing for himself, his family, and God. Upon hearing this, Mark looked at the detective and finally admitted to what he had done. He repeated that the girl didn't suffer, and he said he had strangled her. He immediately added that he hadn't done anything else to her. According to Mark, that evening, Kaylee came to his apartment and asked to play with his 1.5-year-old son. He let her in and took her bike to the kitchen. He knew Kaylee's mother wouldn't allow her to come to this place, so he decided not to attract attention. Kaylee went upstairs to the second floor of the apartment, to the children's room, where she started playing with the child. About 10 minutes later, Mark heard Judy in the yard, calling her daughter's name, and he panicked. He realized that her mother would be furious that he had let the girl into his house without her permission, so Mark went up to the children's room and strangled Kaylee with his bare hands. Detective Crow immediately had doubts about some parts of this story. It seemed much more likely that Mark himself lured Kaylee into his apartment under the pretext of playing with his son, taking advantage of the fact that his wife was at work. There, he could have tried to molest her, and when he heard Judy calling her name, he might have become frightened that Kaylee would tell her everything. The detective also remembered that Judy saw him outside wearing sneakers without laces, suggesting that he had used them to strangle the victim. This would mean that the crime was not as spontaneous, as he would have had time to think it over while taking the laces out of his shoes. Apparently, Mark tried to minimize the severity of his crime by changing some details in this story. But Crow understood that if he voiced his doubts, Mark might change his mind and refuse to say what he did with the body, and the detective needed to obtain this information. So, he continued to play along and listen to the story. Mark claimed that after committing the murder, he took Kaylee's body to the kitchen and left her on the floor. Then, he took his son and went outside to create an alibi for himself. He kept hearing Judy call her daughter in the yard, so he deliberately wanted to be seen by her and dispel any suspicions. After the woman saw him in the playground and went to search the complex territory, Mark returned home and placed Kaylee's body in a laundry basket, covering it with clothes. A few minutes later, he took the basket outside and placed it in the trunk of his car, By that time, there were already many people in the yard helping Judy look for her daughter. According to Mark, there was such chaos that nobody even noticed him. Mark also took his son with him and drove to the company where he worked as a security guard. He parked near the back of the huge building and left the basket with Kaylee's body by the door, then drove around and entered through the main entrance. Given that Mark had the day off, he lied to his coworkers about forgetting something at work. The story didn't raise any suspicions, so Mark walked through the building and opened the back door from the inside. He took the basket with the victim's body and climbed onto a huge 30,000-gallon tank filled with liquid coolant. He opened the top lid and dropped Kaylee in, first tying a heavy metal object to her. Afterwards, he disposed of all the victim's clothes but specified that he didn't remove the victim's earrings. Once done disposing of the body, he returned home and immediately joined the search for Kaylee with the other neighbors. Basically, he managed to remove the body from the complex even before the police got involved, and no one noticed anything. At the end of his confession, he stated that killing Kaylee was a big mistake and he shouldn't have done it. Having obtained all the necessary information, Crow paid for their food and Mark left a $2 tip. Then, he willingly went with a detective to the station, where he was arrested on a charge of murder. As soon as Mark's lawyer learned about his confession, he tried to withdraw it, but it didn't work out. Mark provided all the information voluntarily, and Detective Crow didn't break any laws. The police immediately went to Mark's workplace and opened the tank. 2 years later, the victim's body was still inside, although the degree of decomposition didn't allow experts to determine the cause of death or any other details. They could only confirm her identity, and Judy finally got to bury her daughter. Mark admitted his guilt to the judge and was sentenced to a minimum of 25 years in prison, just as Detective Crow had told him. The man's lawyer managed to negotiate a deal where his client had the kidnapping charges dropped and only faced punishment for the murder. But Mark's story didn't end there. In 2010, the police reopened an old case from 1988. A 74-year-old woman named Viola Manville was brutally murdered while taking a walk in a suburb of Rochester. Detectives had several suspects, including Mark, who was only 16 at the time, but he had passed a polygraph test during interrogation, showing no signs of deception. Eventually, a man named Frank Sterling was arrested for the crime. At first, he denied his guilt, but after a relentless overnight interrogation, he confessed to the murder. After being in prison, Frank tried to appeal his sentence, claiming that the police coerced his confession and that by the end of the interrogation, he could barely comprehend what was happening. However, all of Frank's attempts to prove his innocence failed until 2010, when the case was reopened and all existing evidence was sent to the lab. Experts found a DNA sample from the suspect, which did not match Frank's, but perfectly matched another inmate from the FBI database, Mark Christie. In 2011, at the age of 39, Mark confessed to Viola's murder and received an additional 28 years in prison. However, he did not disclose the motives for his actions and showed no remorse. As for Frank, he was released from prison after 19 years of wrongful imprisonment. He sued the authorities and received nearly $10 million in 2014. But just 3 years later, he died of a heart attack at the age of 54. Mark continues to serve his sentence in prison, but he may be eligible for parole in a few years. However, there are no guarantees of his release. It is worth noting that if investigators in Viola Manville's case had not fixated on another suspect and coerced him into confessing to a crime he didn't commit, Mark might have been incarcerated earlier and he wouldn't have had the opportunity to kill Kaylee. Unfortunately, things turned out differently. Charlotte Senna was born on September 4, 2014, in the small American town of Greenfield, New York. Growing up in a large and loving family, she was in the middle of 3 sisters. Charlotte was a lively and cheerful child. She enjoyed playing with friends, spending time with her sisters, and going on nature trips with her parents. Greenfield, with a population of just over 5,000 residents, was surrounded by forests, lakes, and picturesque parks, making it a perfect getaway for Charlotte's family. On September 30th, 2023, when Charlotte was 9, her parents, along with some friends, decided to visit a national park about 11 miles from their home. Charlotte looked forward to this trip, planning to go with her friends and bringing along their bikes for a ride through the park. Upon arrival, the parents set up a camp, and soon the kids set off on their bikes. The park had specially designed circular tracks, one of which was conveniently located near their camp, so Charlotte and her friends chose that track for their ride. They set out around 6:15 in the evening, aiming to return to the camp before nightfall. After a few laps, Charlotte's friends wanted to head back, but she decided to do one more round. Her friends rode back toward the camp, and Charlotte went in the opposite direction on her bike. Sometime later, her parents started worrying, as Charlotte should have been back by now. A single lap on that track took no more than 10 minutes, even if you were riding slowly. However, Charlotte still hadn't returned, and the adults went searching for her. They walked along the circular track, and around 6:45, they made a distressing discovery. Charlotte's bicycle was abandoned next to the trail, but the girl was nowhere to be found. The parents immediately feared the worst scenario, that someone had abducted their daughter. There were no logical reasons for the girl to leave her bike in the middle of the path and walk away. For a brief moment, they considered that there were some issues with the bicycle, but it became evident that it wasn't the case. The wheels were intact, and the chain was in working condition. Fearing the worst, her parents decided to call the police. Officers arrived on the scene approximately 15 minutes later and immediately began searching for Charlotte. The sight of her abandoned bicycle led them to a disheartening conclusion. She was most likely abducted. Still, they couldn't dismiss the possibility that she might be lost in the woods, so they initiated a search. The police scoured the entire park and closed it to visitors. They checked everyone's vehicles and camps before letting them go. Some people wanted to stay and help with the search, but without proper organization, it only complicated the police's job. They combed through every inch of the forest. Initially, officers focused on the area along the circular trail Charlotte had been riding, but found no leads. They then expanded the search to cover the entire park. However, it proved to be quite challenging. The park spanned about 15 square kilometers. The police sought assistance from park rangers, the fire department, and state police to cover the extensive area. The FBI also joined the investigation, focusing on efforts to identify a potential abductor. They tried to obtain CCTV footage from every surveillance camera near the park and along the nearby roads. They believed that if Charlotte had indeed been kidnapped, the perpetrator must have driven her away by car. FBI agents also requested information from the Park Service about all visitors. Since everyone had to register and pay to enter the park, their personal information was stored in the database. However, examining it took time due to the considerable foot traffic in the park that day. They also obtained data from cellular providers regarding the location of all phones present in the park when Charlotte went missing. Considering the possibility that the abductor might have entered the park without registering, the FBI agents aimed to match visitors' data from the Park Service with the cell phone locations, potentially identifying a suspect. Yet, gathering all this data was a time-consuming task. It also involved approximate phone location tracking via cell towers, not precise GPS tracking. The search continued until the late night without yielding any results. Early the next morning, officers returned to the park, and the search team grew larger. In total, over 400 people participated in the search for the missing girl. Police also reached out to the public through the media, urging people to share any information related to Charlotte's disappearance. The case quickly gained widespread attention, with the state governor addressing the issue at a dedicated press conference and showing support for the family. That same morning, the police activated the Amber Alert system, allowing them to quickly notify residents about the child's disappearance. They hadn't used it on the first day to ensure Charlotte wasn't simply lost in the park. Now, it was almost certain she had fallen victim to abduction, as she should have been found by now if that wasn't the case. Unfortunately, the searches once again yielded no results, and the FBI's attempts to identify the abductor were unsuccessful. By the evening, the police began to realize that finding Charlotte alive was becoming more and more unlikely. The crucial first few hours after a child's abduction are vital, and within that time frame, there's a high chance of locating them alive. However, as the search for Charlotte surpassed this critical window, the statistical likelihood of a positive outcome significantly diminished. Yet, both the police and Charlotte's parents weren't ready to give up. Early on the third day, they returned to the park to continue their efforts. Meanwhile, around 4:20 in the morning, a man approached the Charlotte family's house in a car. He walked up to the mailbox, dropped in a letter, and quickly drove off. A police officer was observing the house from a distance, but didn't approach the man, thinking he might be a family acquaintance expressing support for Charlotte's parents. Throughout those days, various people had visited the house, leaving letters and food. But despite the officer's initial hesitation, he found the man suspicious and decided to check the mailbox. Inside was a note that instantly changed the course of the investigation. There was a letter written by the kidnapper stating that he had been holding Charlotte and was willing to let her go in exchange for $50,000. The note was immediately sent to the lab, where experts urgently began their analysis. Soon, they uncovered several fingerprints and ran it through the databases, but there were no matches. Around 2:30 p.m., they made the second attempt, and there was a breakthrough. The fingerprint matched a 47-year-old man named Craig Nelson Ross Jr. He had been in the New York State database since 1999, following his arrest for DUI. Ross lived just a few miles from the Charlotte family's house, and the police quickly headed there. However, they encountered a problem. The house at the address had recently been seized due to the man's failure to pay property taxes for years. Researching information on Ross, the police quickly learned that he had been residing in a trailer on his mother's property. The woman's house was located 14 miles away from Greenfield. The police swiftly obtained a warrant and sent over 30 officers to the scene, with a helicopter covering them from the air. They surrounded the trailer, stormed in using flash grenades, and arrested Ross. The man attempted to resist, but he was quickly apprehended. At first, there was no sign of the girl, leading officers to believe she might not have been there. They thoroughly searched the entire trailer and looked into a locked closet. Under a pile of rags, they found Charlotte. She was alive and immediately rushed towards her rescuers. She was promptly taken to the hospital for examination, where doctors confirmed there was no threat to her life. Family members were immediately brought to the hospital, where they reunited with Charlotte, and soon she was taken home. Her parents, along with hundreds of people participating in the search, were overjoyed. It is worth mentioning that just 10 minutes before her release, Charlotte's mom shared a strange premonition. At that moment, she was in the park where active searches were ongoing. She expressed a strong feeling that hinted her daughter would come home that day. And 10 minutes later, the police informed her of Charlotte's rescue. Meanwhile, detectives arrested Ross without bail and took him in for questioning. Given the fact that this case is still ongoing, the police haven't disclosed any details of the interrogation. However, it appears he did not admit guilt, so the case will be forwarded to the court. But some information about the suspect and his motives is already known. Ross's ex-girlfriend told journalists that in 2017, she obtained a restraining order against him. At that time, she lived with him, his 12-year-old son, and 4-year-old daughter in his mother's house. During an argument, he attacked her and attempted to strangle her, leading her to report the incident to the police. According to the woman, Ross may have been planning the abduction for months. She revealed that throughout his life, he never wanted to work, always seeking ways to live off others, mostly on his mother, playing on her empathy by claiming to suffer from a serious illness, and she agreed to support him. Ross's ex-girlfriend believes he initially targeted Charlotte's family for a specific reason. Despite the girl's parents being of ordinary middle class, her late grandfather had substantial wealth. In 1998, he slipped and suffered a severe injury, subsequently suing the city and receiving over $2 million in compensation. Even after more than 20 years, many Greenfield residents still remembered this story. The ex-girlfriend stated that Ross was aware of this payout and likely decided to profit from the kidnapping. Considering that Charlotte was abducted from the park when left unattended for just a few minutes, Ross must have been watching her. According to his ex-girlfriend, he could have been observing the family for a long time, studying their routine and waiting for the right moment. There was another fact indicating that the crime was premeditated. According to his ex-girlfriend, several months before the incident, he covered his trailer with a tarp, something that he had never done before. Considering that he kept Charlotte there, this could indicate careful preparation. Ross's neighbors also shared troubling observations. One woman recounted a past incident where Ross tried to take her 10-year-old son somewhere, and she had to intervene. Another neighbor stated that his family had always been problematic, and Ross, from an early age, regularly went to neighbors asking for food. Later, the police uncovered additional details about Ross's criminal history. A year before the attack on his girlfriend, he was arrested for stalking but did not face serious consequences. Just a month before Charlotte's abduction, he was suspected of sexually assaulting his underage relative, but the case was closed for some reason. Reporters also spoke with his son, who was an adult by that time. He expressed hatred for his father, wishing for him to die in prison, but did not share any specific details. About a month after Ross's arrest, the police made a disheartening announcement. In addition to kidnapping, he faced charges of sexually assaulting Charlotte. Apparently, during the time Ross held the girl in his trailer, he managed to commit some horrible deeds, but the police have not disclosed any details yet. It is known only that Ross refused to admit guilt regarding the sexual assault charges and plans to defend himself in court. Considering the fact that the abducted girl was found in his trailer, he probably has no chances of avoiding jail. Besides the fingerprint on the ransom note, investigators also found indirect evidence confirming his involvement. Analyzing the location data of all phones in the park at the time of the abduction, they discovered that Ross's smartphone was one of them. So, there are practically no doubts that the man will go to prison. However, as preparations for the trial are underway, detectives are also exploring Ross's potential connection to two other unsolved cases. In August 2003, 18-year-old Jennifer Hammond was selling magazines in the town of Milton. After her shift, she was supposed to meet with colleagues but never appeared at the designated spot. 6 years later, her remains were found near a lake 11 miles from town. It's worth mentioning that she disappeared just a few hundred yards from the house where Ross was living at the time. 2 years later, 19-year-old Christina White left a trailer park a mile away from Milton and disappeared. A year later, her remains were found, but the case remained unsolved. As for Ross, he was living in the same trailer park at the time. Now, the police are considering his possible involvement in these murders, but currently, they lack any evidence, or they are withholding it in the interest of the investigation. Regarding the trial for Charlotte's case, it is set to begin in April 2024. Despite the presence of undeniable evidence of his guilt, it cannot be ruled out that Ross may be offered a plea deal. In case he continues to deny guilt, Charlotte will likely have to testify in court, recounting in detail what he did to her. To spare her such a traumatic experience, a plea deal might be an option. Now all we can do is wait for the trial and hope that justice will prevail. Mitzi Sanchez was born on August 10, 1992, in Vallejo, California. She grew up in a large, close-knit family with 2 brothers and a sister. Mitzi was a cheerful and bright child. She enjoyed spending time outdoors with her friends and playing with her siblings. From a young age, Mitzi was quite independent. When she started elementary school, her parents allowed her to walk there with her brother without any adult supervision. The school was located just a short distance from their home, with most of the route lying along a busy road. August 10, 2000, was Mitzi's 8th birthday. She was excited about the celebration party her family had been preparing for her. Mitzi asked her mom if she could skip school for the occasion, but the woman said no. Mitzi was upset about it, and around 7:30 a.m., she left her home with her brother. After her classes, Mitzi was supposed to wait for her brother so they could walk home together. But when her brother went outside the school, he couldn't find his sister anywhere. Thinking she had already left without him, he headed home alone. But it turned out that Mitzi wasn't there. Their older sister, who was home at that time, immediately became worried. Since Mitzi was eagerly anticipating her birthday party, her absence seemed odd. She waited for some time, hoping that Mitzi would eventually show up, and around 4 p.m., the sister decided to call their mom and tell her about it. Their mom immediately called Mitzi's school and learned that her daughter had attended all her classes. The mother then reached out to family members and Mitzi's friends, but no one had seen her after school. Mitzi's relatives became worried and started searching for her. Many people, from family friends to neighbors, also joined in. Together, they quickly organized a massive search. While some of them walked the streets, others knocked on every door along the route, from the house to school, asking if anyone had seen her. They even started printing and distributing flyers with information about Mitzi. Despite all their efforts, they couldn't find her, so Mitzi's parents decided to call 911. The police immediately joined the search, and local media started covering the case on the same day. Mitzi's disappearance instantly captured the public's attention, since similar incidents had already occurred in their town before. For several years, an unknown perpetrator or multiple perpetrators had been kidnapping kids in Vallejo. The most recent case had occurred in December '99, less than a year before Mitzi's disappearance. 7-year-old Ziana Fairchild, who lived just a few miles from Mitzi's house, disappeared on her way to school. Despite all the efforts by the police and the FBI, she was never found. Now, when Mitzi vanished on her way home from school, investigators feared the same perpetrator might be involved. Despite the lack of leads at that point, the striking similarities between those cases were already obvious. However, Ziana's case remained unsolved, leaving detectives with little to go on. They began re-examining everyone previously considered a suspect in her case, but it yielded no results. The next day, Mitzi's disappearance made headlines not only in the local news, but statewide. Everyone feared a serial kidnapper was at large and dreaded the possibility of him getting away with it once again. Mitzi's relatives gave multiple interviews, trying to draw more attention to the case. Her mom also pleaded with the possible abductor to return her daughter safely. The police received numerous tips, but none of them proved useful. However, everything changed 24 hours after Mitzi's disappearance, when something unexpected happened. A man contacted the police, informing them that he discovered bloodied rags at a landfill. Upon examination, experts determined that the rags were actually bedsheets from a Vallejo hotel. Although they sent the evidence to the lab, blood analysis would take days. Investigators also visited the hotel, but were unable to confirm whether Mitzi had been there. With nothing but waiting for lab results, investigators combed the landfill, searching for any other clues, but it yielded nothing. The following day, August 12th, the police received another call, and it changed the course of this case immediately. At around 11 a.m., a man reported driving through an industrial area in Santa Clara when a little girl ran up to his van, screaming that someone was chasing her. She climbed into the van's cabin, and the driver saw a man running in their direction. The girl yelled that he had kidnapped her and wanted to kill her. As soon as she was in the van, the perpetrator turned around, got into his car, and fled. Meanwhile, the girl told the driver her name was Mitzi Sanchez, and he contacted the police. Officers immediately picked her up and drove her to a hospital for examination. They also called her mother and let her speak to her daughter. Soon after, her relatives rushed to the hospital and reunited with Mitzi. Meanwhile, detectives spoke with the van driver. The man proved a crucial lead. He remembered the license plate of the kidnapper's vehicle because it drove off right in front of his van. It turned out the van driver was on that road almost by chance. He had a day off, but was asked by his supervisor to cover a shift and deliver a load. If he hadn't been there, the perpetrator possibly could have caught up with the girl. The police ran the license plate and identified the car belonging to a 39-year-old man named Curtis Dean Anderson. He had been on law enforcement's radar before, with prior convictions for thefts, kidnapping, and suspicion of other crimes. As investigators focused all efforts on finding the abductor, their colleagues prepared to hear Mitzi's account of what had happened to her. She told them that on August 10th, she was eagerly awaiting the end of school to go home and celebrate her birthday with her family. When her final class ended, Mitzi decided not to wait for her brother and headed home alone. Just a few hundred yards away, she noticed a parked car by the roadside. Inside was a man, watching her intently through the rearview mirror. Mitzi felt uneasy about him, but quickly brushed it off. It was daytime, she was on a familiar street, and being young, she didn't fully grasp the potential danger posed by strangers. As Mitzi approached the car, the man got out and asked her to help him. He said he needed to grab a roll of tape from under the car seat. He also explained that he couldn't bend down himself due to a leg injury from falling off his bike. Despite her uneasy feeling, Mitzi agreed to help. At that time, she couldn't fully comprehend the potential danger posed by the adult man, and her parents had always taught her to help others. As soon as Mitzi reached for the tape, the perpetrator shoved her inside, covered her mouth with his hand, and slammed the doors shut. Mitzi tried to scream, but it was too late. The kidnapper drove off in an unknown direction, leaving her to gaze out the window in horror. At one point, they passed Mitzi's home, and she saw her relatives preparing to celebrate her birthday. A few minutes later, the kidnapper pulled into a deserted parking lot. He gave Mitzi new clothes, forced her to change, and discarded her old clothing in a nearby trash bin. He also warned Mitzi not to try to escape, claiming he had a gun and that no one ever managed to get away from him. In the next few hours, he drove Mitzi in an unknown direction. At one point, she asked why he had kidnapped her, and the man simply replied that the same had happened to him when he was a child. When it got dark, he parked again and began covering the car windows with some rags. He then pulled out a chain and secured it to Mitzi's leg with a padlock. Then, the perpetrator took out a bottle of alcohol and forced her to take a few sips. Mitzi tried to argue with him, but eventually complied with his demand. After that, the man grabbed a camera and took several pictures of Mitzi, then laid down to sleep right in the car. Mitzi tried to keep her eyes open, afraid of falling asleep. She was thinking how to escape, and at one point saw a police car drive past the parking lot, but it was far away, and even if Mitzi had screamed, the officers would never have been able to hear her. The next day, the perpetrator continued driving her around the city. He made her sit on the floor of the car and covered her with sheets to hide her from view. At one point, he stopped and got out for a few minutes. Mitzi tried to free her leg from the chain, but quickly realized it was impossible. She also found a nail file and attempted to unlock the padlock, but it didn't work. When the perpetrator returned to the car and drove away, he claimed he had stopped by her parents' house. The kidnapper pretended to be a concerned citizen and asked for flyers to distribute around town. Mitzi was shocked and overwhelmed. She had been so close to home, yet still remained in captivity. Throughout the next few hours, the perpetrator stopped several times, getting in and out of the car. In the evening, he drove out of town and parked in a deserted area, where he sexually assaulted his victim. After that, the man fell asleep, leaving Mitzi in a state of shock. The next morning, he drove off again, making several stops along the way, mainly to buy cigarettes and alcohol. At one point, when he returned to the car and leaned into the cabin, something fell out of his pocket. He told Mitzi not to look there and left again. But the girl didn't listen to him. She glanced down and saw a large bunch of keys. Mitzi quickly realized that one of them must unlock the padlock on her chain. She was afraid of what the perpetrator might do to her if she disobeyed, but eventually, Mitzi overcame this fear. She grabbed the bunch, picked a key that seemed to fit the lock the best, and attempted to unlock it. To her surprise, it worked. Mitzi freed herself from the chain. Now, only the car door stood between her and freedom. Mitzi opened the window and tried to climb out through it, but she encountered another problem. She was so exhausted that she could barely move her legs. Gathering all her strength, she managed to lift herself and leap out of the car. As she crawled around it, she spotted her kidnapper, who immediately noticed her. The man began shouting for her to come back, but Mitzi had no intention of giving up. With her last ounce of energy, she ran in the opposite direction. The perpetrator chased after her, while Mitzi tried to flag down passing cars for help. She waved and screamed, but they all drove past. Despite this, Mitzi kept moving toward her freedom. She had no doubt that if she stopped for even a second, the perpetrator would catch up and harm her. Everything happened very quickly, but for Mitzi, this moment stretched on forever. Eventually, she spotted a van, ran towards it, and jumped right in front of it. The driver quickly stopped, and Mitzi climbed into the cabin. She was shocked, dehydrated, and hungry, but her life was no longer in danger. At the hospital, doctors provided her with the necessary assistance, and soon her entire family arrived to reunite with her. Mitzi's miraculous rescue instantly became the main news story in the city. When she was brought home, thousands of people gathered on her street. They applauded her and shouted birthday greetings, which she had missed. Meanwhile, the police were hunting down the kidnapper, whose whereabouts remained unknown. When they showed his photo to Mitzi's mother, she realized she had actually seen him twice. The first time was before her daughter's abduction, when he stood on their street and looked towards their house. The second time was the day after Mitzi's disappearance, when the perpetrator came to her home and asked for flyers. The search for Curtis continued until late evening. Police set up surveillance at all known places he frequented, and eventually it paid off. He came to a trailer park and was apprehended without resistance. Curtis was booked in jail, awaiting trial, and detectives began investigating his possible connections to other crimes. The man himself told Mitzi she wasn't his first victim, and no one had managed to escape him. Investigators simply couldn't imagine this being his first crime of its kind. All his careful and likely premeditated actions suggested he had significant experience in committing such atrocities. It's worth mentioning that Curtis had been previously imprisoned for kidnapping a woman in 1991. He was released in November 1999, and now the police were confident that after his release, he had killed at least one girl, 7-year-old Ziana Fairchild, but we'll get back to that shortly. There was also no doubt that he intended to kill Mitzi. Moreover, one specific fact directly indicated that it was supposed to happen on the day of her escape. Police learned why Curtis had stopped in the industrial area. He used to work there at one of the companies, and that day he visited his former colleagues. He had asked them for a large bag, and detectives immediately realized he planned to dispose of a body in it. After Curtis's arrest, Mitzi struggled to recover for a long time. However, she soon learned that the police were suspecting him of kidnapping Ziana, which made her even more uneasy. While Mitzi was glad she managed to escape, she also worried about the fate of this 7-year-old girl. More than 8 months have passed since her disappearance, and there was no news about Ziana's fate. Mitzi wanted to help find her, so just days after her own rescue, she participated in a search operation along with other volunteers. Unfortunately, they couldn't find any new leads on Ziana's possible whereabouts. This continued until January 2001, when a human skull was found in the mountains near the city of Santa Cruz. Forensic analysis showed it belonged to Ziana, and she was officially declared dead. Mitzi took this news very hard, but ahead of her was another challenge: the trial. It began in April of the same year. Mitzi had to testify before the full courtroom and recount in every detail what Curtis had done to her. He was also present there, but despite all of this, Mitzi managed to fulfill her task. In the end, Curtis was sentenced to 251 years in prison, but that wasn't the end of his story. Detectives repeatedly visited him in jail and asked him questions about his possible involvement in other crimes. At one point, they learned that Curtis had confessed to a fellow inmate about kidnapping and killing 8 other girls. The inmate agreed to cooperate with the police and repeated Curtis's words in detail. But Curtis himself wasn't ready to reveal all his secrets. He didn't deny anything, but tried to negotiate various privileges for himself, speaking with detectives in riddles. Eventually, the man hinted that he had indeed murdered Ziana Fairchild and that he had killed at least 13 other girls and women. It wasn't until 2005 that he gave full confession in Ziana's murder, and for that, he received an additional 50-year sentence. As for Mitzi, her challenges didn't end with Curtis's trial. Just a few weeks after her rescue, she returned to school where she faced bullying from other children. They called her the kidnapped girl, said she should have died instead of being saved, and generally behaved extremely inappropriately. As a result, her school years became a heavy burden for her, and along with the tragedy she had experienced, it didn't help in her recovery process. Mitzi also repeatedly joined the searches for other missing children, but more often than not, it ended with the discovery of their bodies. Each time, she felt this tragedy as if it were her own, and ultimately, she couldn't cope with this pressure anymore. Alcohol became her only way to cope with the stress, and with each passing day, Mitzi turned to it more and more frequently. Eventually, she stopped seeing even the slightest chance of returning to a normal life. But one day, everything changed. Mitzi was involved in a serious car accident after a party with friends. She broke her neck, arm, and spent 2 weeks in a coma. When she woke up, doctors informed her that she is pregnant and would have a daughter. This news turned her life upside down, and Mitzi found the strength to change it for the better once again. She decided to dedicate all her time not only to her daughter, but also to other children who became victims of various crimes. She founded a non-profit organization that continues to provide assistance to those in need to this day. As for Curtis, he died of illness in 2007, just 6 years after being sentenced. The only reason the detectives regretted it was the fact that they had not managed to obtain full confessions from him regarding other cases he was suspected of. Although they still haven't been solved, the police continue to consider his involvement highly probable. It is worth mentioning that Curtis had a son who followed in his father's footsteps. He was convicted of murder, and in 2019, his own life ended in prison. Alright guys, share your thoughts on this story in the comment section, and don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Thank you for watching.